Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that even after the Battle of Yorktown, King George III did not want to give up the fight? He wanted to keep going, thinking that the war was still salvageable. That during negotiations with the British, the Americans went behind the back of the French, negotiating without their approval, which flew in the face of their instructions from Congress. And that after the war and after the treaty was signed, granting the United States independence, all of the British didn't actually leave their forts in the United States, which will be a big deal in the future. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn about that and more in episode 70, the Treaty of Paris and the End of a Revolution. Hello, welcome into episode 70, the first episode in this podcast in which we finally have a United States of America. Pretty exciting, and we will get there. We will get there eventually here in this podcast, because that's what we'll be covering today. The end of the war, the Treaty of Paris, and of course, in turn, the creation of the United States of America. I'd like to thank our new patron, Valerie, for supporting the show. Thanks so much for signing up to be a patron of the show. Speaking of Patreon, we have a Q&A coming up with myself, Zach, and Bill that we'll be recording likely next week. So if you have any questions about the American Revolution that you would like answered, you can reach out to me via email, chris@ateachershistory.com. Find me on Twitter @ateachershist, or find us on the Facebook page, and we'll be doing that. And next week, I will be wrapping up. This American Revolution is Unit 3. And I will be doing a Unit 3 review and basically wrapping up the entire revolution, the 20 or so episodes we've spent on the Revolutionary era, and then before moving on to what will be Unit 4. So, to catch everyone up, I'd like to briefly provide context for our lesson today. Last week, we discussed the second part of the Southern strategy and the Franco-American victory at the Battle of Yorktown. And as a reminder, the surrender at Yorktown wasn't the absolute end of the war, but that being said, the sentiment in both the ministry and in Parliament eventually became one that favored finding a way to bring an end to this war. Give the rebels their freedom and figure out what to do next. The Whigs pushed this agenda as forcefully as they could, with Horace Walpole, when hearing of the defeat at Yorktown, actually exclaimed, quote, "Whatever puts an end to the American war will save the lives of thousands. Millions of money, too." Lord North resigned on March 20th, 1782, with Germain following him out, and an almost entirely new ministry was created to advise the king on creating peace terms with the Americans and the French. And this was a ministry that the king wasn't so fond of because, well, they wanted to advise him on creating peace terms. Because remember, King George III wasn't totally ready to admit that England should give up their efforts, stating, quote, "When men are a little recovered from the shock felt by the bad news, they will then find the necessity of carrying on the war. though the mode of it may require alterations. Obviously, King George III was a bit out of touch with the political and practical momentum of the war and the votes that he was losing in Parliament day after day. When Parliament opened on November 27, 1782, though, he was ignoring all the obvious signs by proclaiming that the war was going on longer than he expected. Yes, he would admit that, and that losing Cornwallis's force in Virginia was a setback. But in the end, giving up the colonies in America would be the first step to the dissolution of the British Empire. And that was something he was just not ready to go on board with. And it also didn't help that Lord Germain was in lockstep with him. But their enemies in Parliament were having none of it. They put forth a motion on December 12th that stated, quote, "All further attempts to reduce the Americans to obedience by force would be ineffectual and injurious to the true interest of the country." Pretty powerful statement. But this motion was defeated, and the men went on Christmas break. But then they returned from Christmas break, and the opposition to the war continued. The momentum did not slow down. They called motion after motion, with their votes coming closer and closer to winning. At 2 a.m. on February 24th, 1782, finally, a motion to suspend the war in America was successful, passing by 19 votes. It was at this point that Germain decided to resign, with the entire rest of the cabinet also stepping down about 2 weeks later. Funny enough, though, the British continued to fight the French, Spanish, and the Dutch, and they were actually finding some success against them. The British defeated de Grasse's fleet in the West Indies and defeated a potential French-led uprising in India. But let's focus on the American side of all of this. The soon-to-be United States of America created a peace commission that consisted of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Lawrence. Jefferson had to hang back in the colonies to take care of some personal business, and Lawrence had been held as a prisoner of war in the Tower of London since 1780 and played basically no role in the negotiations. Therefore, the Peace Commission was more or less a three-man group: Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. While these three men were incredibly shrewd politicians and negotiators, they were thrust into this challenge seemingly with one hand tied behind their back, so to speak. Congress had given the men specific instructions to consult with the French officials to make sure that they took any and all advice from their French allies when ironing out the details of the peace. Can you imagine that? Being a representative of a country in which your job is supposed to negotiate a peace that gets the best terms for your country, but the terms you have to negotiate are terms that have to be approved by another country. I mean, there are a couple huge problems with this premise. If the instructions were sent from Congress when victory in the conflict wasn't as apparent as it became after Yorktown. These instructions were actually sent, prior to Yorktown. Because when you think about it, who really saw this victory coming at that point? Additionally, there was another inherent problem with these instructions. They were disingenuous. Because, see, John Adams was appointed the French representative in 1779, and he was straight up incorruptible. There is no one in American history who is more stubbornly principled than John Adams. He drove a lot of people crazy with his unwillingness to give even an inch on such matters of principle. And on top of that, if you were to look up the definition of patriot in the dictionary, it more or less describes John Adams to a T. Because of this, France bribed one Mr. General John Sullivan, a New Hampshire delegate. Soon after this bribe, Congress appointed more men to serve with Adams, weakening his influence, and sent them to France with the explicit instructions to, quote, trust the French and take their advice. And of course this was a problem, because while the French and the Americans were allies during the war, the things they desired in peace negotiations were not going to be the same thing. In what might come as a bit of a surprise, it was actually John Jay who fought against these stipulations with the most vigor, claiming that, quote, "We can depend upon the French only to see that we are separated from England, but it is not in their interest that we should become a great and formidable people, and therefore they will not help us to become so." The Americans were intent on getting control of land as far west as the Mississippi, and they were wary of the French control of Canada and how easy it would be for them to begin to move south and encroach on Ohio country. On top of this, the Spanish complicated matters. They still had not recognized the United States as an independent nation, and they were actually meeting with the British during the war and conveniently forgot to tell France about it. Britain was aware of these dynamics, and Lord Shelburne, who was appointed to the King's ministry and who became responsible for negotiations with the colonies, wanted to figure out a way that he could play the French and the Americans against each other. Shelburne sent Richard Oswald to Paris to begin negotiations with the Americans, specifically Benjamin Franklin. When the two first began their discussions, acknowledgement of the independence of the United States was not a given, and that was a sticking point. Additionally, Franklin was throwing around the desire to get Canada from the British too. As negotiations progressed, it seemed to Britain like the French may be losing a bit of conviction in helping the Americans hold a hard line. As I mentioned a couple moments ago, de Grasse's fleet in the West Indies had gotten roughed up by Admiral Rodney, and this loss, along with the decreasing momentum, made John Jay and Benjamin Franklin weary of possible British and French communication in the summer of 1782. And their hunch was correct, because the British and the French were in fact meeting secretly behind their back. So much political maneuvering. Can you trust anybody these days? But this unwillingness to recognize the United States of America as independent seriously was an issue. Franklin and Jay refused any type of negotiation until it was resolved. I mean, this was insulting. You lost the war. Get over it. Recognize us as independent and then move on, right? In September of 1782, Oswald was given permission to speak with the two as representatives of the United States. Franklin and Jay probably looked at each other and said, that's good enough. That's recognizing our independence, right? Okay, great. Let's do this. After about 3 months of negotiations, the British and the Americans had an agreement in place. But what about the French? Weren't they directed by Congress to include the French and do what they told us to do? Yes. Did they ignore that direction? Yes. But you may say, Chris, hold on. The Treaty of Alliance with the French precluded the U.S. from making a treaty with Britain without any type of French involvement or input, and the Treaty of Alliance had no end date, so it was still in effect. And this is where Franklin's diplomatic brilliance shined through. The Americans included in the agreement with the British that it did not technically go into effect until after the British and the French had come to terms with their agreement. Therefore, the French still had the ability to negotiate concessions. But of course, with Britain having already agreed to terms with America, now their negotiating power is weakened and their options are more limited. On top of this, the French had to be really careful. The last thing they wanted to do was, punish the United States for what they've done and ruin their relationship to the point that the Americans then turned toward the British and worked to repair their tattered relationship. The French need to make sure the Americans still dislike the British a lot more than them. The treaty that was signed, the Treaty of Paris of 1783, because there's more than one, as you'll come to find, was a favorable one for the United States. To begin, it recognized the independence of the United States. That's number one. That is a huge deal. It also defined the northern border between the U.S. and Canada, very similar to what it is today. The western border of the United States will be the Mississippi River, and the Americans gained fishing rights off of the coast of Newfoundland and the St. Lawrence. They would also gain rights to travel along the Mississippi River. The British would withdraw their forces with, quote, all convenient speed, whatever that means. And this is a big deal because all convenient speed was a crock. The British remained in the colonies, and they would be damned if they were going to give up their forts in the West and not protect their trading rights in the colonies and their fur trade along the Great Lakes. This is really important because, among other things, the British refusing to leave these western forts in the Great Lakes region is going to draw the U.S. and Britain back into war against each other in 30 years, with the outbreak of the War of 1812, maybe the most overlooked major conflict in American history. But overall, the Americans were able to win pretty good terms. The British wanted a couple things also, though. First, they demanded that all debts be collected and guarantee that a government, the U.S. government or the state governments, would not stand in the way of this. Also, they wanted all private property of the Loyalists returned to them. That's a big ask. And Franklin J. and Adams weren't really sure how they were going to convince many of these patriots to do this. Upon hearing this, they probably knew there's no freaking way this was going to happen. So instead, they promised to, quote, recommend to the state legislatures that the property be returned. Yes, we will make a strong recommendation. That should do it. Throughout 1783, the U.S., Britain, France, and Spain finished up with some of the fighting, worked out a peace, and ended the war. It all became official September 3rd, 1783. By the end of 1783, Guy Carleton, the new commander of the British forces in the colonies, had packed up and sailed home. And the British Army, at least for the most part, once and for all, had left. Except for all the ones hanging out in the forts in the Northwest. While many Americans celebrated this momentous occasion, partying like crazy and toasting pretty much every person you could imagine who was involved in the conflict, there was a bit more to this victory than the bravery of George Washington, the endurance of the soldiers, the allegiance of France, and the diplomacy of their representatives. This war was a challenging one for the British, and if they were being honest with themselves, the Americans probably would have toasted many people from Britain, too, for helping them win the war, unintentionally. Now, the British had fought in America before. It was not necessarily a foreign land to them. The terrain itself wasn't the biggest challenge, nor was really the overall geography. The biggest challenge was figuring out how to deal with the American people. The British realized sooner or later that they had gotten themselves involved in a civil war with individuals whose allegiances could sway from one side to another if prompted, and whose actions were as unpredictable as their emotions. On top of this, the American resourcefulness could not be denied. They had gathered a Congress, created an army, and were in the field to fight a major engagement in a really short period of time. Oh, and they kept fighting for 7 more years. Because of this confusion and really unprecedented spot that the British found themselves in, they decided to go with what they knew and what they were familiar with: 18th century conventional warfare. And this is where they made their biggest mistake. On the other hand, though, the Americans, with nothing to lose, decided they were going to forge a new path and try to redefine 18th century warfare. Part of this changing dynamic was the enthusiasm and passion that drove many Americans into the field of battle. They weren't fighting because they were told to or because it was their job, but instead they had a cause, a purpose. Zach and I have mentioned numerous times how important it was that the Americans were fighting a war of ideas and how different that was from the British motivations. Washington, although deep down was sort of in love with the idea of creating a European army, even understood, maybe begrudgingly, how important a militia was, but more importantly, understood the power of fighting for a cause and fighting with passion. When considering some threats of resignation earlier in the war, Washington wrote that, quote, "In such a cause as this, where the object is neither glory nor extent of territory, but a defense of all that is dear and valuable in life, surely every post ought to be deemed honorable on which a man can serve his country." With these words and Washington's actions came a personal and individualized ownership of not just the war but also the outcome. It was their war, not a war waged by the wealthy elites that they were fighting. So let's talk about some of the things that led to victory for the Americans, such as the British failures and really the American successes. When considering the American motivations for war, it is all too apparent that they likely had a much better idea of what their endgame was than the British. One of the challenges the British had in this conflict is that they couldn't agree on exactly what the ideal outcome was. Members of the ministry, parliament, and the commanders in the field all differed on what they thought the relationship with America should look like after the war. And of course, the lack of an effective vision negatively impacted their ability to carry out its execution. And hopefully now, with this in mind, you can better understand why the presence of the French, Spanish, and Dutch really complicated matters. And that brings us to the British leadership in the colonies. I think it's fair to say that both Howe and Clinton lacked any type of true strategic vision for the war. Howe's refusal to act aggressively toward Washington early in the war allowed him to continue to live another day, after day, after day. And Clinton's short-term thinking prevented him from making any considerable changes to the strategy in 1780 and 1781. And then Cornwallis, who was likely the most skilled tactician that Britain had, made the irreparable mistake of fortifying Yorktown, and even worse, not escaping at the pleading of his officers when he may have still had a chance. As I mentioned last episode, Clinton and Cornwallis weren't the best of friends. Clinton viewed Cornwallis as a rival instead of a subordinate, and because of that, Cornwallis's ambition grew, further limiting their ability to effectively work together. And speaking of Yorktown, it's a perfect example of the British not taking advantage of their Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world. Up until the French joined the fun, Britain had total control of the sea, and even after the French joined, they likely still could have maintained that dominance if they had really committed themselves to doing so. But instead, they did not invest enough in the Navy, and it showed in de Grasse's early dominance of the West Indies and his victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake, which led directly to the victory at Yorktown and the end of the war. Lastly, I think that the Howe brothers likely exemplify another problem that the British had, and that is that many of the commanders were not enthusiastically carrying out this war. It was clear in 1775 that the Howes, especially General Howe, was not too fond of the idea of killing Americans. Yeah, they were technically the enemy, but man, they were sort of English. I think that may have played a role in his hesitancy and likely the lack of fire most of their leaders showed during the conflict. Remember, all culture and attitude starts at the top. And that brings us to the Americans and what they did right. Unlike the British, the Americans more or less had a clearly defined plan in this war. The plan was put an army in the field, fight, get foreign nations to help, get the British to quit. That would lead to independence, freedom, and self-government. Pretty straightforward. While those ideas did admittedly take a while to develop, once they did, it became a consistent and unwavering battle cry for the Americans. The type of messaging that has staying power and eventually could convince some of the more neutral colonists to support. That isn't to say that there weren't serious issues in the Continental Army. We detailed the problems they had with payment, food, clothing, etc. But these problems didn't have anything to do with the larger purpose or goal behind the conflict. Unlike the British, the Americans found themselves the good fortune of having a commander who was perfect, and I mean perfect, for this role. With a united message and a cause and the necessity to fight a defensive war focused not on winning, but instead not losing. Patience, emotional regulation, and an objectively discerning nature were critical to whoever the American commander was going to be. And fortunately, George Washington had all of these character traits. On top of these, the one quality that I didn't mention, one that I want to mention all by itself, was his humility. It was critical. Did Washington have an ego? Well, of course he did. Did he have a lot of confidence in the areas of leadership? Yeah. Was he more or less desperate for the role to probably reconcile for his previous failures and own insecurities? Probably. But his humility and self-awareness were critical character traits that became more apparent as the war progressed. Washington did not openly seek popularity in the war. He was not out for glory or for bragging rights like so many of his own men and so many of the British officers. He was sincerely and consistently devoted to the cause of Republican liberty, and this consistent devotion won over his men in the long run. Washington was able to judiciously examine his failures and, for the most part, learn from them. His plans were, often overly complicated, and he likely was too stubborn about embracing the power and effectiveness of the militia, but he balanced his ego with a genuine desire to improve, his insecurities with a growing confidence, and his lack of victory in battle with some seriously awesome retreats. Through these retreats and the campaigns throughout the war, Washington also showed a brilliance in logistics. He was able to do some pretty amazing stuff in requisitioning the supplies his men needed and keep his army together. He was decisive enough to make his game-changing attacks on Trenton and Princeton, bold enough to fight in the face of overwhelming odds in New York, and wise enough to take Rochambeau's advice and ditch New York for Yorktown. And heck, I didn't even mention his creation of the spy ring and its impact on the war. There's a special Patreon episode on that if you want to check it out. It's really impressive. As you can likely tell, I'm a pretty big fan of General Washington. But he wasn't the only American leader that I have a man crush on. Men like Daniel Morgan, Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, von Steuben, Lafayette, and heck, even Benedict Arnold, for a couple years, were critically important to America's success in the war, and their contributions to the effort really cannot be overlooked. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to keep in mind that these men and their achievements are celebrated, as they should be. But let's not forget how close they were numerous times to failing. For, in the end, they are just that, men. They made mistakes. They allowed their egos and imperfections to sometimes desire short-term outcomes in the face of long-term opportunities. They were fortunate to have foreign assistance and an enemy who was not as effective as it could have or should have been. But throughout the entire conflict, these men knew that win or lose, they were not going to be entirely restrained. Win or lose, they were going to change history, one way or another. Next week, we'll review this American Revolution, a Unit 3 wrap-up, before moving on to the next stage in the history of the United States. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.